Good day everybody, welcome back to Teaching Methods of English. We're going to look at our 8th unit, Teaching Listening. The points that we're going to cover in this class are 1. What listening involves, the importance of listening, challenges of teaching listening, principles of teaching listening listening sequence. Next, we're going to look at the task-based metacognitive instructions, which are activities or tasks that you may use in your class. 7, we have got listening skills and strategies based on the objectives and competencies that are stipulated in NSSC syllabus. And last, we're going to look at how listening is assessed in the NSSC examination for the grade 10 to 11. So what does listening involve? We need to understand that listening is not just about hearing. Listening is not a passive, undirected skill, but it's a highly interactive process that involves linguistic and cognitive process. Linguistic has everything to do with language, and cognitive has everything to do with the brain and the thinking, what happens in the mind. Active listening involves one-way or two-way listening context. The explanation of the one-way and the two-way will be done later in the unit. There are suggested sub-skills that active listening involves, and this has been stipulated as 1, showing interest and building empathy through body language and back channeling. Echoing, so this is like repetition of what you said. Clarifying, either giving clarification or asking for clarification. Paraphrasing, re-saying, stating what you heard in a different way or different words. Commenting, okay, I think this is very clear, and questioning. Now, let's look at the importance of listening. Why is listening important? 1, listening is important because we need to understand that it really occupies a big chunk of our time that we spend when we are communicating. Like, we have to listen quite a lot, right? And not just speak all the time. And think about, the time you spend listening to other speaking or listening to songs, news, lectures, YouTube, you name it. We do a lot of listening. And we have got the advancement in technology that really have raised the portfolio of listening skills that we may use in our language teaching. Like, technology has afforded us a chance to make listening more accessible in our language teaching. And we know that listening provides input that can be very significant for second language acquisition in general, and for the development of the speaking skills in particular. So listening is just not about practicing listening and become a proficient listener, but it also helps the students when they listen quite a lot. It affects or it helps them improve their own speaking skills. Listening promotes a nonlinear processing of language. All right. When you are processing language, it's not always like from point A to point B, but it can be a circular or zigzag process. So it helps one to process their language, and it also encourages learners to develop a holistic strategies to text. So it means that it helps them develop strategies, like really whole strategies that they will help them process the text that they are reading. Teachers, we as language teachers, we need to think of how then we can incorporate listening in our own teaching and provide opportunities both inside and outside class for our learners to be exposed to significant amount of input, listening input. We really have to think through how we can help our learners to be exposed to as much listening as possible, as we have seen that the more the students or the more the learners are exposed to listening input, the better they become in their speaking skills. And not just the speaking skills, as well as their listening strategy and skill processes as well. So it's really important for us to really think through of how we can have our learners be exposed to as much as listening input as possible. However, there are challenges that come with teaching listening, and that we'll look in the next section. All right, so what are some of the challenges that comes with listening? We are going to look at some of the challenges that the learners language learners do experience, or some of the factors that make listening quite challenging. The first one is that listening involves multiple modes. And what do we mean by that? So listening involves multiple modes. What do we mean by this exactly? We have got listening involves interpersonal and interpretative modes of communication. And what does that mean exactly? It means that there are times when the learners have to take on a participative role in the conversation. This conversation can be face-to-face or telephonically, like either online. And then there are times when they are taking on a non-participative role, which means they have to listen. There are times when they have to really participate in the conversation, as it has been mentioned in the first part. And then there are times when they are not really participating, but rather being, I don't want to say like passive, but they listen more when other people are speaking or presenting. And I would say that this point is very much related to the one-way listening versus the two-way listening. So two-way is more participative, and then the one-way is non-participative role that the learners take on when they listen. So it's like this switching from participative and non-participative can be challenging for the learners. The next point is that listening involves all variety of language. So in addition to listening to lectures and presentation in an academic and formal setting, learners also have to partake and listen to exchanges that involves various level of colloquialism. So that is to say that there is just no, our learners are basically exposed to more academic and formal English for the most part, but then there are times when they have to take on other kinds of language or register that they need to decipher and make sense of. The formal, the slang, the informal, we're talking about slang, and then for different groups there's a certain way that they use language, so they need to decipher all that. Next, listening involves altered and reduced language forms. So that is now to say that there are times when vocabulary and other different kind of structures may be reduced, and they need to understand that. And here we have an example of I wanna go. So they need to figure out what does wanna means, or just a sec. They need to decipher like what does sec mean? It means second. Wanna means I want to. All right. There are many examples that we have that falls under the reduced or the altered language forms. The next point is that listening involves variable rates of delivery. And what do we mean by that? It means that when the learners are listening, their dependence is very much on the person who's speaking and the speed at which the speaker is speaking. All right, it's not like reading whereby they have more control of how fast they can read. But when it comes to listening, their understanding very much depends on the speed that the speaker is speaking at, and that they cannot control. Because of all these factors, just the few factors that we have looked at, listening often create high levels of anxiety, stress among learners that can interfere with their comprehension. So some of these factors really do affect their understanding or their comprehension, because there may be anxiety or stress when they come to listening activities. And for us teachers, we also know that there are many challenges that comes when we are teaching listening. And for example, the way, we have quite a lot, starting from the learner's need, the portfolio of the learners that we have. It comes to our own training if we are not well trained, or we are not well exposed to how to teach listening. That can also cause a challenge. And then there are also the aspect of the availability of materials and technology that may also affect listening, as well as our personalities. Also, those do contribute to the challenges that we may face when we are teaching listening. Our next point is on the principles of teaching listening, and these are the principles given by Dr. David Noonan in his 2015 textbook on teaching English to speakers of other languages. The first principle that we're going to look at is teaching students to use both bottom-up and top-down processing. And I should mention that the explanation of all these principles will come shortly. The next point is that we need to incorporate a range of text types in our listening lessons. The third one is incorporate a range of pedagogical and real-world tasks in our lessons. And the last one is incorporate strategy training in our teaching. Now, when it comes to this point of using bottom-up and top-down, you might be wondering, so what do we mean by bottom-up and what do we mean by top-down? We'll look at the explanation below. What we need to understand as teachers is that for the learners to be an effective, proficient, successful listener, they need to use both top-down and bottom-up processing. When we are talking about bottom-up processing, we refer to the incoming data as a source of information about the meaning of a message. So what do we mean by that? So that basically means for one to understand, to comprehend, the dependence is on what is being said. All right. There is no use of background knowledge or previous experience, but the dependence is basically on what is being said, such as the sounds, the words, the clauses, the sentences that will then give the learners understanding. So it's at the sentence level, it's what is being said. Their understanding is processing what has been said as it is in terms of words, sounds, clauses, and sentences. Comprehension is thus viewed as a process of decoding. Examples of a bottom-up processing listening includes, so the first one that we have is scanning the input. So scanning what is being said to identify familiar lexical items. So the familiar words that they do know. All right. So it's like you listen, you scan what is being said, and then picking up what you know is being said. All right. The meaning of the words, basically. Second, segmenting the streams of speech in grammatical constituency. So it's like whatever that you listen to, then you have to put them into appropriate grammatical parts. For example, we've got subject, verb, object, for instance. Do you understand? So to get the subject, the meaning of and the action that is being said, and the effect that comes with the action that is being said in the stream of speech. The next one is using phonology cues to identify the information focused in an utterance. So again, here we are also focusing on the sounds. Do you understand? Phonology is everything with the sounds that you hear, and then the cues that comes with the phonological cues. Then the learners need to use these phonological cues to identify the information that is being said. Using grammatical cues to organize the input into constituents. For example, in order to recognize that, the book which I lent you. So here we have got now, you have to organize this, all right, in grammatical cues. So which always it's giving you an idea that you are going to say something extra about what has been said here. The book which, so which means when you say which, it means that extra information is going to be given about the subject that has been said before which. I hope that makes sense. And if it doesn't, please do ask your questions. Top-down processing, on the other hand, refers to the use of background knowledge in understanding the meaning of the message. And background knowledge may take several forms. It may be, previous knowledge about the topic that is being discussed. It could be contextual knowledge or situational knowledge, like you need to understand the meaning based on the context of the situation. Or it may be knowledge that has been stored in a long-term memory in the form of schemata or scripts. And when we're talking about schemata and scripts, I hope you do understand. By now you do know what schemata means. And these are basically plans about overall structure of events and the relationship between them. So that is to say that schemata is, the accumulated experiences that you have had, and then you have stored that in the long-term memories, like it's part of you now. And then top-down, in other words, top down is you understanding, or you or the learners understanding what is being said, but your understanding is not based on what is being said exactly. It's not, you focusing on the sounds, the words, the sound meaning, the word meaning, the clause meaning, and the sentence meaning, but rather you are using your previous experience, your background knowledge about the topic. You use that to understand the topic better. It's like you already have knowledge about the topic. Let's say we're talking about COVID-19. You have some knowledge about COVID-19. And maybe the information that is being presented about COVID-19 might be very new, might be like different perspective of COVID-19 that you've never heard. But when you are listening to it, to this information, this seemingly new information, you already have your background knowledge of COVID-19. So now when you are listening to this information, you store it under different sections that you already have in your mind, that you already have on COVID-19. It's like you pack that new information into the component in your brain where you have stored information on COVID-19. Top-down processing involves drawing back on background knowledge to help make sense of what you're listening. So it's like you depend on your previous knowledge, background knowledge, to help you understand better of the topic that is being said. How do we do this? Psychologists say that we do it by drawing on schemata. I've already explained what schemata is. And there's more explanation. Great. Schemata are like mental movie scripts that are built up from an early childhood. When we learn, we constantly adjust our pre-existing schemata and add on new ones. So I think I've already explained that in the previous point. It's like you already have knowledge and then you're just building onto the new knowledge. You're either readjusting it as well as adding more information on the topic or the discussion that is taking place. Now we're going to look at more explanation on the second point, which says that we need to incorporate a range of text types in our listening lessons. Learners need to be exposed to a wide range of text type. And here, when we're talking about text, it's not just about reading, but it's listening material, starting from monologue to dialogue, from casual conversation in which people are socializing to interaction in which the speaker is trying to obtain goods and service. So we need to really expose them to the different kinds of listening materials that are out there. They should also be given an opportunity to watch all types of television shows, from sitcom to news. So television broadcasting, we may say that. Public announcement, recorded telephone messages, advertisement, and so on. We need to incorporate all these types of listening in our lessons. And then when it comes to learners going out of the classroom, so listening shouldn't just stop there, but we also need to encourage them to listen to the wide variety of listening materials that is out there. And then with the use of the internet, we have so much more materials that we can have our learners listen to and practice listening. And some of the examples that are given here are YouTube clips, TED Talks, and also modified news broadcasting. And I think maybe I should provide you with a link at a later stage on some of the broadcasting that have been modified for language learners. And modified, we mean that they have been changed or they have been brought to the level that the language learners may understand. A much discussed concept in communicative language is authenticity. I don't know if we've discussed, but we should have in the reading unit where we're talking about authentic materials. And this is a quite discussed topic. And the type of authenticity that we're going to look at in this unit are the text authenticity. This is like the listening material authenticity, and the task. This is what is being done, what is being listened. Text authenticity. This is like the type of material that is being listened to. And then task authenticity, this is more of the type of tasks, the type of activities that the learners will do, like the authenticity of the type of activities that they will do or in the classroom. So authentic listening texts are the ones that are originally emerged in the course of some types of communication outside the classroom. In other words, in simple terms, is that authentic listening text, listening materials, these are the ones that come from the real world, the outside classroom, and you bring them into the class to use it as materials that we can teach our learners with. And some of the examples that we are given are casual conversation in a shop. So it's like a conversation, English conversation that happens in the shop, news broadcasting, a talk show, and so forth. And so we bring them, as it's stated here, we bring them for the purpose of really teaching our learners listening. We need to understand that obviously there is a place for both authentic and non-authentic text. And when we're talking about non-authentic text, the text that are created, like the purpose of the creation of this material is for language learning. All right, it's kind of contrived. It's molded in such a way that it makes some sort of language structure, for instance, visible in that material. All right. For example, if we want to teach learners on how to formulate questions, right? Or let's say tag questions. Then because we want to focus on tag questions, the conversation is going to have a lot of tag questions. Do you understand? Tag questions are used over and over to show emphasis. But then in authentic materials, you cannot have a conversation and you have tag questions, like so many tag questions in a conversation. That is not possible. So that is now the difference. It's like the language, non-authentic texts are the ones that really are created for the language learning lesson or classroom. And we do have a place for both the authentic, the real conversations that happen, or the real talks that happens in the real world. And we also have a place for the non-authentic text. All right, both of them we have to use them. Like there's no bad or good about one and bad about the other. No, or advantage or disadvantage about the other. They all have a place in our language teaching. But the trick is for us now to adjust the task, what learners have to do in response to the listening rather than the listening itself. So it's like whatever that we are going to expose them to or have them listen. It could be authentic text or non-authentic texts. But then now we only have to think. We need to think more about then what tasks are they going to do? What kind of tasks are we going to create for them when we are using these types of listening? So we need to incorporate a range of pedagogical and real-world tasks in our lesson. So in addition to text authenticity, which we have just mentioned in the previous principle, which is talking about exposing to learners to different kinds of listening texts, here we're going to talk about the tasks. And as we can read, if we are to go back to the title of the principle, is that we need to have pedagogical. So these are more modified, maybe we can say non-authentic tasks. And then the real world tasks, these are more authentic tasks. To understand, we have to incorporate both of them. And here's the explanation. In deciding whether or not a task is authentic, we need to take into our bearing, like into consideration from the world outside the classroom, and ask ourselves, is this something that people do outside the classroom? So to explain this is more of when we are thinking about, is this an authentic task or is this a non-authentic task? We have to think about what really happens in the world. Can we really call this as an authentic text when we look at? Or is it a non-authentic task when we look at that task in terms of what the learners need to say? Okay, for instance, we do know that when people in the real world, when people are listening to a machine, like when they are listening to a message, let's just say that when somebody is listening to a voice memo on WhatsApp, it's a message that they get. People don't complete the set of true or false question. We know that, right? In the real world, like there's no set of true or false question. But rather, it has everything to do with you listening to the message and doing what the message requires you to do. You don't have to complete a true or false question. But in a language class, there's always a set of true or false questions that may, or some sort of questions that follows the conversation that requires the learners to respond to. So now we do know that when it's a task that requires learners to do a true or false questioning, then that obviously is a non-authentic question. It's a non-authentic task. It's a task that is made for the language classroom. There is a place for non-authentic tasks, listening text in the language classroom, and the same point, the same idea, the same point applies to listening, non-authentic listening tasks. Both of them have a place. We do have a place for having learners do a true or false question in the classroom. But there should also be tasks that enable learners to rehearse in the class the sort of things that happens outside the classroom. So we just don't need to have learners always do some tasks that are modified for the lesson, but we also need to assimilate, to do role plays of what really happens in the real world. Because we are not just teaching them language for the sake of the examination and for the sake of the English classroom, but we also need to teach them English that they can use when they go outside the classroom. They're not going to be learners forever, remember that. We also need to remember that listening will involve some sort of production. It could be speaking or writing tasks. But then when we are in a listening, like our main focus is on listening, then we don't need to penalize the learners quite a lot by looking mainly on these other skills. We need to focus more on what is being listened. We need to focus more on the listening skills and strategies, and and rather than focusing quite a lot on what they say and what they write. This is quite a tricky point, because how do you know that the students really heard or they understood what is being said? Obviously, we're going to have some sort of production that will show that they have understood or not. So now I guess maybe if we have to go back here, it's like, okay, in a listening class, you shouldn't really focus on quite a lot on their writing. It's like, okay, you're teaching them how to write, like spend more time on writing or spend more time on speaking when the main focus is listening. Obviously, we're not going to teach listening by itself or in isolation. We always need the other types of skills, skill tasks that will show that the learners did understand what they heard. So some of the examples of the other kind of task, like how other skills are related to the task that they are doing when they are listening, could be, answering some questions, and that could be done orally or written, taking a telephone message. So those are just a few ideas that they can do. Or after listening, they can do a presentation. Do you understand? So it means that they do need other skills to show that they have comprehended what they have read. But we shouldn't penalize them so much, or we shouldn't make judgment weigh more on these other skills when listening is the focus. Is like really so much of the focus during the lesson. Or the response might be non-verbal. Okay, we need to understand that it can be non-verbal. Like when, for instance, they might be listening to some instruction. So they're given instruction and then they need to assemble something, or they need to assemble pictures based on what they are listening to. Or it could be play a game after listening to instruction. Or it could be they listen and then they draw a picture. And then we'll see some of these examples later in the type of activities that you may do in your classroom when you're teaching or you're focusing more on listening. So we need to understand too that the richer the variety of tasks that we have in the classroom, the more interesting the lesson will be, for both the learners as well as the teacher. It's like the activities don't need to be so boring or the same one that they do over and over. We need to give them a variety of different activities or different tasks that they need to do in the lesson. Our last principle that we're going to look at is incorporate strategy training in our teaching. Noonan has stressed quite a lot on the importance of really training our learners exposing them to different strategy. It could be listening strategies, it could be reading strategies, it could be writing strategies, and we need to train them on how to use those strategies and use them. The purpose of training learners with some strategies is really huge, is very important, because it's not just about what you're listening to, but it's about what you are listening for. And for you now, what are you listening for? For you to know what to listen for, it's like you need to have some sort of strategies that you will use to help you capture what you are listening to. It is also important, we have already mentioned this. And now we're going to look at some of the strategies that successful listeners use. One, we have got prediction, thinking about what the listening will be about. And then after, like when you are listening, you listen out for whether your predictions are correct or not. The next one is inferring. This is basically listening between the lines. And I think I should give you an example related to inferring. Let's imagine that it's winter, right? And you go and visit your friend in his or her room, but you found that his room's windows are open. Your friend is wearing a jacket. He probably just opened, or she just opened the windows because she wanted fresh air into the room for a little bit. And then when you come into the room, it's very cold, right? You're cold already, you're coming from outside. When you come in, you say, "Yo, dude, your room is very cold." When you say that, "Oh, your room is cold," your friend decided to stand up and then close his or her window and put on a heater. So it's like your friend inferred from your statement that you need to close, he or she needs to close the windows because you are cold. All right. So that is basically listening between the lines. It's like it's not stated directly, but this person has to gauge from what they hear the meaning behind what is being said. Monitoring, the listener is noticing or paying attention at what he or she understood or did not understand. It's like always thinking about, okay, did I understand that? Did I not understand that? Why did I not understand that? For instance. And then clarifying. So let's say they don't understand something that they need to clarify, which means you need to ask questions or give feedback about what you did not understand. And this could be, an example could be like asking questions. What do you mean by when you say something? Or it could be giving feedback like, "Oh, dude, I really didn't understand what you said." And then we've got responding, which means you are reacting to what you hear. Responding could be now giving an answer or taking an action based on what is being said. Evaluating, this is checking whether you really did understand something or not, just evaluating. Or evaluating, checking what you heard, like the quality or the validity of what is being said. Now let's look at some of the teaching listening sequence. And the listening sequence that we're going to look at are very much related to what we have covered in the reading class, like pre-skill, while skill, post-skill. All right, here we've got pre-listening, while listening, post-listening. All right, this sequencing framework for planning listening offers, teachers to have flexibility to vary the activities according to the objectives and especially strategies that they need to focus on in their lessons. And we have got this sequence, right? Pre, while, and post. But what we include, like the type of activities that we do or tasks that we do in these different in these different phases, all right? They are called phases. Pre, while, post, they are called phases. So whatever that you're going to include in these phases are not going to be the same all the time. Because remember that we have got this huge syllabus that we need to cover. And then for us to cover the content within the syllabus, the skills that are, the competencies and objectives that are covered in the syllabus, we need to now change these activities and objectives within the 3 phases. And also the type of activities that we include in the different phases are those that are going to help you attain the objectives that you have taught. All right? So this is the same explanation basically. We are starting with the pre-listening phase. All right, before we start talking about pre-listening phase, I should mention that a well-designed listening activity should be broken down into careful sequence phases that build on each other. So that is to say that pre-listening is going to build, like we need to build on, okay, we start with pre-listening and then we build on the pre-listening with the while listening, and then the post-listening is also going to build on these two phases. It's like everything has to work together. The initial pre-listening phase should prepare the learners by helping them activate their background knowledge, so the top-down processing, and clarify the expectations and assumptions about the text. So we have to tap onto the previous knowledge that the learners have in the pre-listening phase, as well as tell them the expectations of whatever listening activities that they're going to do, and the assumption that comes with that text. An ideal pre-listening activity or pre-listening task that you may use is one whereby you as a teacher, through careful constructed questions, you help your learners activate the background information and language components needed to comprehend a text without giving this information to the learners. So you need to create well-constructed questions or constructed activities that are going to tap or activate the previous knowledge that the learners have on the topic that they're going to discuss, as well as look at some language components. It could be vocabulary, it could be grammar that you think they need to know or need to understand when they listen to a text. But when you look at this previous knowledge and when you look or you focus on these language components, you don't give out the information that is stipulated in the list, the listening content or listening text that they're going to cover in the classroom. We are moving on to the while listening phase. Global comprehension refers to the understanding of the very general idea or gist of the text after the first or second listening. While the students might pick up some details after the first listening, here our aim should be to help them focus on the general meaning first, so that they can establish preliminary framework that will enable them to get more details in the subsequent listen. So that is to say that the first thing that the learners need to do when they listen to a text, right, when they are listening to it the first time, they need to get the main idea of text, the general gists of the text. And when they have this general understanding of the text, then it's going to help them get the detailed information that will come with the listening. Holistic listening means listening to the whole text, while segmental listening involves listening to specific segments of the text. Alright, so we have got different kind of listening here as stated. The holistic one, the whole listening, and the segmental is like focusing on specific parts of the listening. Holistic listening should precede segmental listening. So I think this idea is basically the same one as this one, whereby they need to get the general understanding of the whole text first before they start focusing on parts of the listening. And then this is done with the aim to allow learners to develop strategies and build stamina in the processing of the text. So they get strategies that they need to know what they're going to use when they are listening to segmental listening. And then segmental listening is very beneficial when they are doing intensive listening. So intensive listening has everything to do with like segmental listening, where they need to listen to certain parts and they need to answer certain questions, detailed questions. We need to remember that we should allow the learners to do listening of the whole text a few times as a whole before they focus on the intensive listening. All right, so they do a whole listen of the text first to just get the main idea, and then after they have gotten the main idea, then they can listen like intensively on parts of the listening to get detailed information about what is being said. We also need to encourage our students or learners to focus on global meaning first. So this is basically the almost somewhat related, and don't pose questions that ask them for details after the first listen. So the idea is just reaffirming this, that they need to listen to the whole text first without really getting details about the text, but they need to get the main idea, and then after that's when you now give them another listen to listen for details. We need to encourage our learners to make assumptions, like predict after their first listen, I guess before their first listen, and then verify them when they are listening. So, I mean, assumptions could be, we do prediction in the pre-listening, and after they have done the first listen, they can also make assumption because they haven't really focused on all the details, right? And then they can verify those assumptions during the second listening. We need to focus our questions and attention at the stage of the segment, so at the stage of the part of the text that are accessible to the learners in terms of vocabulary and structure. And always remember that students or learners do not need to get every single thing that has been said in the listening text. Within the while listening phase, we are going to look at the intensive listening. Intensive listening is the one that has everything to do with really focusing on details of the text. When designing listening activities, we need to keep in mind that in addition to global understanding, like the main idea, we also need to focus attention on intensive listening. This is crucial to help learners develop effective listening strategies and build bottom-up listening skills. So bottom-up has everything to do with like focusing on what is being said, the words, the sounds, the clauses, and the sentences. All right. And when we do intensive listening, it helps them build their bottom-up listening skills and strategies, in addition to the top-down skills that emphasize on global listening activities, like getting the main ideas and focusing on background knowledge to get the main idea. Intensive listening involves zeroing in on particular segment, particular parts of the text, and this should come only after the students have developed the global comprehension of the text. Intensive listening may target different goals, and these goals could be, getting more detailed understanding of some segments of the text, some parts of the text, transcribing certain segment of the text, guessing the meaning of words or phrases in context or from context, looking at a certain grammatical structure in the text to see how they can aid comprehension, and etc. Intensive listening activities can be done in class. It could be done in the lab. The lab part really happens mainly in private schools, not very much in public schools, and unless that school is really well resourced. And it can be given as homework or assignment, all right, depending on where you find yourself. Because some places the learners may have access to listening technological tools that they can use to listen. But we can make use of things like a radio, TV, if they have that. You make use of the cell phone a little bit more for also educational purpose rather than just entertainment or personal use. At the lower level of instruction, consider doing global comprehension activities in the classroom to work on strategies and utilize group work, and assign the intensive listening part for homework. I mean, as I've mentioned here, it depends on where you find yourself, like how you can maximize using intensive or assigning intensive listening parts for homework. If you know that your students are from places where they will not have access to technological tools to have them do the intensive listening, then you can tell them that during the break or after school they can stay behind to do the listening activity. Yeah, you can ask them to do that. Do you understand? If you really want to assign that as homework. But if after school might be impossible, then you should also include intensive listening during the classroom. Now we're going to look at the post-listening phase. Post-listening activities represent a follow-up to the listening activity and aims to utilize the knowledge gained from listening for the development of other skills such as speaking or writing. I think that one is very clear. And let's say if the class have listened to a TV program and that is presenting a certain point of view regarding, let's say, mental health, because mental health is really huge these days, just as an example, then the teacher can ask the learners to do some research and identify some opposing views to present them in the classroom. So it's like they have done listening on mental health and there's a standpoint that has been presented in the listening. So it could be really like the importance of mental health, or, how mental health can be sustained. So when the learners go outside, they can do research on how something point of view of why mental health is really not regarded as an important discussion in, let's say, Namibia. Why are people not discussing it? Why is it not regarded as important? Do you understand? So that could be research that they can do, all right? Or how does mental health, because this is just the general presentation of mental health, and then they can do it specifically by looking at how is mental health affecting teenagers, for instance. Alternatively, the teacher may want to engage the discussion of the merit views that were presented or expressed in the listening segment. So that is now to say that you can, after they have listened, they can have a discussion of like, what are the benefits of the discussion that they have received, or what are the values of the information that has been expressed. So that could also be an activity that they can do after they have done the listening. Post-listening activities allow for recycling and further activation of vocabulary and structures as long as they are interesting and engaging and are carefully thought out. So after they have done the actual listening, you can focus on certain vocabulary, right? And you can teach them the vocabulary, and then you can ask them to use the vocabulary in a text, for instance, or in their own utterances, like dialogue that they need to create, and they need to use this vocabulary, or some kind of grammar structures that you want them to focus on, and then they need to use these structures in their own dialogues or in their own speech.